On August 23, 1939, just 9 days before the outbreak of the Second World War, Hitler's National Socialist Germany and Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union secretly negotiated a non-aggression pact between both states. This was made possible thanks to the diplomacy of the foreign ministers of both European powers, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov. The German-Soviet pact consisted of two parts, one public and one secret. The public part was a non-aggression pact in which each signatory promised not to attack the other. They also promised that if one of the signatories was attacked by a third country, the other would not provide any kind of help to that other country. In addition, the two agreed that they would not participate with other powers in any agreement against the other, either directly or indirectly. The non-aggression agreement would remain in force for 10 years and would automatically renew for 5 more years if neither of the signatories acted to end it. The secret part of the pact consisted of a protocol that established the Soviet and German spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. It recognized Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia as part of the Soviet sphere. The signatories agreed to divide Poland along the Naro, Vistula, and San rivers. Hitler always considered the German-Soviet non-aggression pact to be a tactical and temporary maneuver. He never intended to respect the terms of the agreement for 10 years. His long-term plan had always been for German forces to attack the Soviet Union and establish living space for Germans in the captured territories. Before taking this step, however, Hitler intended to subjugate Poland and defeat France and Great Britain. The non-aggression pact allowed Germany to wage these intermediate wars without fear of a Soviet attack, thus avoiding a two-front war. In July 1940, 1 month after Germany defeated France, Hitler ordered preparations for war against the Soviet Union. German diplomats worked hard to secure Germany's flank in southeastern Europe. In November 1940, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia joined the Axis alliance. Thus, confident from his previous feats and conquests, the Führer decided to focus his attention on Eastern Europe, specifically on the Soviet Union. Hitler was ready to break the peace with Stalin. Eager to turn the Soviet Union into a kind of colony of the German Third Reich on June 22, 1941, Hitler, with military support from the Axis forces, launched his plan to invade the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler believed that the invasion would conclude before winter, and he forbade his generals to think otherwise. In this way, 1 day before the invasion, 50,000 German soldiers waited for the start of the largest military operation to date, distributed from Finland to the Black Sea. About 950,000 soldiers from other nations allied with Germany accompanied the Germans. These troops would play a fundamental role in the German disaster at Stalingrad a year and a half later. By December 1941, it was clear that the course of the war in the Soviet Union was not what the German High Command had planned, because Leningrad and Sevastopol continued resisting in the north and south, respectively, and the offensive against Moscow had reached a stalemate. Then, when they least expected it, the Germans found themselves fighting against a Soviet counteroffensive from the Russian capital, and they had to face the fact that despite having killed and captured hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers in recent months, somehow the Soviet High Command had found sufficient reserves to launch a powerful counteroffensive. Having failed to capture Moscow, Hitler then focused on the oil wells of the Caucasus. Despite not having the approval of his generals, Hitler insisted on capturing these deposits and scolded them, accusing them of knowing nothing about economics. Operation Blue, as the German campaign in southern Soviet Union was called, had as its objectives the capture of strong points on the Volga first, and, subsequently, the advance over the Caucasus. Naturally, being immersed in a world war, the Third Reich required an enormous amount of oil reserves to keep all its military industry active. On May 10th, General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th German Army, presented Field Marshal Fedor von Bock with an outline of Operation Frederick. Paulus had recently taken command of the 6th Army after its previous commander, Walter von Reichenau, died as a result of a heart attack suffered after jogging in the Russian countryside in sub-zero temperatures. Operation Frederick meant the consolidation of the front in front of Kharkov, recently captured by Germany. However, Marshal Semyon Timoshenko got ahead of Paulus because on May 12th he launched a counteroffensive from Voronezh, whose objective was precisely the liberation of Kharkov, surrounding the Sixth Army in a pincer movement. When 640,000 Soviets along with 1,200 tanks launched themselves against Paulus's forces, he found himself on the brink of disaster. Only the timely arrival of Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army allowed the situation of the offensive to be reversed, and instead of being captured, Paulus's men helped von Kleist's men to capture the Soviet 6th and 57th Armies at Barvenkovo. About 240,000 Slavic soldiers were captured, and Timoshenko's counteroffensive failed. On June 1st, Adolf Hitler and Marshal Fedor von Bock presented Operation Blue to the generals of the Southern Army Group at this unit's headquarters, located in Poltava. Paulus's 6th Army was assigned the task of clearing Voronezh and then heading to Stalingrad, accompanied by Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. Once there, they would be in charge of destroying the industrial complexes and protecting the Caucasus from the north. At that time, Adolf Hitler did not consider the capture of the city necessary. To protect the plans of Operation Blue, the transcription of orders was strictly forbidden. Everything had to be communicated verbally. However, on June 19th, a German plane carrying personal notes from General Georg Stumme about the operation was shot down behind enemy lines, and the papers were captured. Nevertheless, after General Philippe Golikov delivered them directly to Stalin, he rejected them as false, convinced that Moscow remained the main German objective. The offensive against Voronezh toward southern Russia began on June 28th, and Stalin's error was obvious. 2 days later, Paulus's forces crossed the Donets, with the 2nd Hungarian Army and the 1st Panzer Army protecting his left and right respectively. Due to the rapid German advance, Hitler decided to send part of the forces of the 4th Panzer Army, which were attacking Voronezh, to the south. This meant that Timoshenko's forces, which were escaping toward Stalingrad, had more time to do so. The original plan involved the 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army cutting off the Soviet retreat before they regrouped, then attacking Rostov-on-Don, and then going to reinforce the defensive lines of the Caucasus. But, impatient with the delay, Hitler changed the order of the plan, and instead of waiting for Paulus and Hoth's forces, he ordered that Stalingrad and the Caucasus be captured at the same time. Not content with this, Hitler divided the Southern Army Group into 2 forces, Force A and Force B, and placed them under the command of Marshals Wilhelm List and Maximilian von Weichs. Without waiting for Fedor von Bock's opinion, who had led the Southern Army Group up to that moment, he was transferred to Command Army Group Center, replacing Günther von Kluge. Although German fuel reserves were running low after the rapid advance, Hitler made another controversial decision. He divided the forces of the Southern Army Group, taking away the mechanized units from the 6th Army and sending Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army south to help capture Rostov. This decision was made because Hitler believed the bulk of Timoshenko's forces would try to cross the Don River at Rostov instead of continuing east towards Stalingrad. The maneuver was intended to eliminate the remains of Timoshenko's forces, which was not fully achieved. Rostov was captured by the Germans on July 24th. Then Hitler changed his mind again and ordered Hoth's forces to head east towards Stalingrad instead of going south. General Hoth obeyed with concern because this meant his tanks would run out of fuel sooner. Despite this, the German bombing of Astrakhan caused great damage to the city and to nearby refineries. On August 9th, General Paulus's forces managed to encircle the remains of Timoshenko's forces. On August 21st, 1942, the Caucasus mountain range resisted the onslaught of the Axis forces. Just 2 days later, they would have their first glimpse of the city that would be the scene of one of the most brutal battles in history. The German 6th Army crossed the Don River on its way to the banks of the Volga, being only 50 kilometers from the city. The German land advance came from the west and was brutal and overwhelming. That same day, August 23, 1942, the German troops were excited to have advanced from the Don River, and morale was high because they thought the capture of Stalingrad would be easy and quick. From the south, General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army was rushing to reach the southern suburbs of Stalingrad before the Soviets could organize an effective defense. Hoth had received orders to take the city as quickly as possible. The German forces believed they would take Stalingrad in a matter of days, perhaps weeks at most. They had no idea they were about to enter one of the longest and bloodiest battles in human history. On the afternoon of August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe began a massive bombing campaign against Stalingrad. General Wolfram von Richthofen, commander of the 4th Air Fleet, personally led the air offensive. Over 1,000 German aircraft participated in the initial bombing raids. The German bombers dropped thousands of tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs on the city. The bombing was relentless and continued for days. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Huge fires broke out across the city, creating a firestorm that consumed whole districts. The bombing killed tens of thousands of civilians. Many people were trapped in burning buildings or crushed under collapsed structures. The city's firefighting services were completely overwhelmed and could do nothing to stop the massive fires. The Volga River, which ran along the eastern edge of the city, became a bright orange reflection of the flames that consumed Stalingrad. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the air and could be seen for hundreds of kilometers. German pilots reported that they could see the glow of the burning city from over 60 kilometers away. The bombing transformed much of Stalingrad into a landscape of ruins, rubble, and twisted metal. Stalingrad stretched for about 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River. The city was of great strategic and symbolic importance. Strategically, it controlled a vital waterway for transporting oil from the Caucasus. The city was also an important industrial center, with factories that produced tanks, weapons, and ammunition. Symbolically, capturing a city bearing Stalin's name would be a tremendous propaganda victory for Hitler and a devastating blow to Soviet morale. Hitler became obsessed with taking the city, not just for strategic reasons, but because of its symbolic value. Stalin, for his part, was equally determined that the city bearing his name should not fall to the Germans. He issued Order Number 227, which became known as "Not One Step Back." The order was clear and brutal. Any soldier who retreated without authorization would be executed. Blocking detachments were placed behind the front lines, with orders to shoot anyone who tried to flee. The order stated, "Not one step back. This must be our main slogan. Every position, every meter of Soviet territory must be defended to the last drop of blood. We must cling to every scrap of Soviet land and defend it as long as possible." The defense of Stalingrad was placed in the hands of General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army. Chuikov was a tough, aggressive commander who understood that traditional defensive tactics would not work against the German war machine. Chuikov developed a new tactic that he called hugging the enemy. He ordered his soldiers to stay as close to German forces as possible, often only 50 to 100 meters away. This meant that German tanks, artillery, and aircraft could not be used effectively without the risk of hitting their own men. The tactic forced the Germans to fight at close quarters, often hand-to-hand, which neutralized many of their tactical advantages. Instead of open battlefield maneuvers where German panzers and combined arms tactics excelled, the battle became a brutal street fight, where individual courage and determination mattered more than tanks and planes. Chuikov also established his headquarters in a bunker carved into the steep bank of the Volga River, so close to the water that German shells would often overshoot and splash into the river. This location was dangerous, but it kept him close to his men and showed them that their commander was sharing their dangers. The German 6th Army entered the outskirts of Stalingrad in early September 1942. What the Germans expected to be a quick victory turned into a nightmare of close-quarters urban combat. The battle turned into brutal house-to-house, room-to-room, and sometimes even hand-to-hand fighting. Soldiers fought for every building, every floor, every room, and sometimes every staircase. The Germans called this type of fighting Rattenkrieg, or Rat War. They found themselves in an environment where their traditional military advantages meant little. The rubble and ruins created a deadly maze where small groups of defenders could hold off much larger attacking forces. Snipers hid in the ruins and picked off German soldiers one by one. Mines and booby traps were everywhere. Fighting often took place at ranges of just a few meters, with soldiers throwing grenades around corners or through windows. Buildings changed hands multiple times, sometimes several times, in a single day. A famous example was the fight for Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building near the city center. The building was defended by a small group of Soviet soldiers led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov. Pavlov's men held this single building for 58 days against repeated German assaults. They fortified it with mines, barbed wire, and machine gun positions. They dug trenches connecting the building to Soviet lines so they could receive supplies and reinforcements. The Germans threw everything they had at Pavlov's house, including tanks, artillery, and aerial bombardment, but the defenders held on. German commanders later said that they lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they had lost taking the entire city of Paris. Life expectancy for a newly arrived Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. For officers, it was barely 3 days. The casualty rates were astronomical. Yet reinforcements kept coming across the Volga River at night, because the Germans controlled the air during the day and would attack any boats or ferries they saw crossing the river. The crossing of the Volga became known as the Death Ferry. Soldiers knew that many of them would not survive the crossing, as German aircraft and artillery constantly fired at the boats. Those who did make it across often went straight into combat, with no time to rest or prepare. The fighting was so intense and brutal that soldiers on both sides suffered psychological breakdowns. Many developed what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Some soldiers simply lost their minds from the constant stress, fear, and horror of the battle. The noise was constant and deafening. Artillery shells, bombs, machine gun fire, and explosions never stopped, day or night. The smell of death was everywhere, as thousands of bodies lay unburied in the rubble. Food and water were scarce on both sides. Soldiers fought while hungry, thirsty, and exhausted. Medical care was primitive, and many wounded soldiers died from infections or simply from being unable to get treatment. By September, the Germans had pushed the Soviets back to a narrow strip of land along the Volga. At some points, the Soviet-controlled territory was only a few hundred meters wide, with the river at their backs. There was nowhere to retreat. The Germans controlled most of the city center and were pressing toward the Volga along multiple axes of advance. German commanders believed that just one more push would drive the Soviets into the river and end the battle. General Chuikov's headquarters was in constant danger of being overrun. At times, German troops got to within a few hundred meters of his command post, but Chuikov refused to evacuate across the Volga, believing that if he left, the defense would collapse. The Soviets held on to several key strong points in the city. In addition to Pavlov's house, they controlled several large factories on the northern edge of the city: the Barikady factory, the Krasny Oktyabr, Red October factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. These massive industrial complexes became fortresses. The thick concrete walls and steel structures provided excellent defensive positions. Soviet workers and soldiers fought side by side to defend the factories. In some cases, workers would manufacture tanks and weapons in one part of a factory, while soldiers fought Germans in another part of the same building. The fighting intensified in October, as the Germans made desperate attempts to push the remaining Soviet forces into the Volga before winter arrived. Hitler was becoming increasingly frustrated with the slow progress and demanded that his generals take the city immediately. General Paulus launched several massive offensives in October. The Germans brought in fresh troops and concentrated their forces for all-out assaults on the factory district. They used massive artillery barrages to soften up Soviet positions, followed by waves of infantry and tanks. The attacks were partially successful. The Germans captured the Barikady factory and most of the Red October factory, but small pockets of Soviet resistance remained, refusing to surrender. These isolated groups of Soviet soldiers continued to fight from basements, rubble piles, and ruined factory buildings, harassing German forces and preventing them from fully controlling the area. The Germans also captured the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, but again, Soviet defenders held on to parts of the complex. The factory became a hellish battlefield, with fighting taking place in assembly halls, furnace rooms, and underground passages. By late October, the Germans controlled about 90% of the city. The Soviet-held territory had been squeezed into several small pockets along the Volga. From the German perspective, final victory seemed close. They just needed to make one more push to throw the remaining Soviet forces into the river. But the Germans were exhausted. After months of intense urban combat, the soldiers were physically and mentally drained. Units that had started the battle with thousands of men were now reduced to a few hundred. Equipment was wearing out. Ammunition was running low. and winter was approaching. While the Germans exhausted themselves in brutal street fighting in Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command, led by General Georgy Zhukov and Chief of Staff Alexander Vasilevsky, was planning a massive counteroffensive that would change the course of the entire war. The plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to push the Germans out of Stalingrad directly, the Soviets would bypass the city entirely and attack the weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces that protected the German flanks north and south of the city. These Axis allies were poorly equipped compared to German troops. They had fewer tanks, less artillery, and lower morale. Many of them were using outdated weapons and lacked winter clothing. The Soviets correctly assessed that these forces would crumble under a strong attack. The Soviets had been secretly building up massive reserves of men and equipment north and south of Stalingrad for weeks. They moved troops and tanks at night and camouflaged them during the day to avoid German aerial reconnaissance. The Germans had some intelligence about Soviet buildups, but they underestimated the size and strength of the Soviet forces. The plan called for a double envelopment. One pincer would attack from the north, and another would attack from the south. The two pincers would meet west of Stalingrad, cutting off the entire German Sixth Army and trapping them in the city. On November 19, 1942, at 7:30 in the morning, the Soviet artillery opened fire. Thousands of guns fired simultaneously in one of the largest artillery barrages of the war. The northern pincer, consisting of the southwestern front under General Nikolai Vatutin and the Don front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky, attacked north of Stalingrad. The Romanian Third Army, which held the northern flank, was hit by the full force of the Soviet assault. Within hours, the Romanian defenses had collapsed. Soviet tanks poured through the breaches, racing west and south to complete the encirclement. The next day, November 20th, the southern pincer attacked. The Stalingrad front under General Andrei Yeremenko struck at the Romanian Fourth Army south of the city. Once again, the Romanian forces quickly collapsed under the Soviet onslaught. Soviet tank armies drove deep into the German rear areas, destroying supply depots, communication centers, and airfields. German units found themselves cut off and surrounded. Panic spread through many German rear area units as Soviet tanks appeared where they were least expected. Within 4 days, on November 23rd, the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach, about 60 miles west of Stalingrad. The trap was closed. General Paulus's entire Sixth Army, along with parts of the 4th Panzer Army and several Romanian divisions, approximately 250,000 to 300,000 men, were now surrounded in a pocket around Stalingrad. This pocket became known as the Kessel, or cauldron. The Germans were now trapped in the very city they had been trying to capture. When Paulus realized his army was encircled, he immediately requested permission from Hitler to break out to the west while it was still possible. His generals urged Hitler to allow a breakout before the Soviet encirclement became too strong. A breakout was still feasible in late November. The Soviet ring around the pocket was not yet solid, and German forces could probably have fought their way through, although they would have had to abandon much of their heavy equipment. However, Hitler refused to authorize a breakout. He was obsessed with not giving up any territory that German forces had captured. He also believed that retreating from Stalingrad would be a propaganda disaster that would damage German prestige. Instead, Hitler ordered Paulus to hold Stalingrad at all costs. He promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air until a relief force could break through from outside and rescue them. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that his aircraft could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day to the encircled army. This was supposedly the minimum needed to keep the troops fighting fit, but Göring's promise was wildly unrealistic. The Luftwaffe did not have enough transport aircraft to deliver that much cargo. The distances were too great. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns were shooting down German planes at an alarming rate, and winter weather often made flying impossible. The Luftwaffe made heroic efforts to supply the trapped Sixth Army by air, but it was never enough. The transport planes, mainly Ju-52s and some He-111s converted to cargo use, flew mission after mission in increasingly desperate conditions. On good days, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver about 100 tons of supplies. On many days, they delivered much less. Sometimes bad weather meant no supplies got through at all. Over the entire time of the encirclement, the average was only about 90 tons per day, less than 1/5 of what was needed. Soviet fighters patrolled the air routes to the pocket constantly. They shot down hundreds of German transport planes. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the pocket and brought down many more. Flying into Stalingrad became an extremely dangerous mission for German air crews. The supplies that did get through were often the wrong things. Sometimes the planes brought ammunition when food was desperately needed. Sometimes they brought luxury items or mail instead of medicine for the thousands of wounded. The trapped German soldiers began to starve. They slaughtered horses for meat. They ate grass and roots. They made soup from leather belts and boots. When those ran out, some resorted to unthinkable acts to survive. The cold was brutal. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius and sometimes even lower. The Germans had not been supplied with proper winter clothing because Hitler had expected to win before winter arrived. Frostbite became as much of an enemy as Soviet bullets. Soldiers' fingers and toes turned black and fell off. Noses and ears became frostbitten and necrotic. Thousands of men lost limbs to frostbite. Many soldiers simply froze to death in their positions. They would fall asleep and never wake up, their bodies freezing solid in the Russian winter. In the morning, their comrades would find them frozen in whatever position they had died in, sometimes still holding their weapons. Vehicles and weapons stopped working in the extreme cold. Tank engines would not start. Machine guns froze and jammed. The cold drained batteries and made radios useless. Disease ravaged the trapped army. Dysentery, typhus, and other diseases spread rapidly through the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Wounded and sick soldiers had little chance of survival. Thousands of soldiers died every day from hunger, cold, disease, and Soviet attacks. The German Sixth Army was slowly dying in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. In December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, was given command of the newly formed Army Group Dawn. His mission was to break through the Soviet encirclement and rescue the trapped Sixth Army. Manstein planned Operation Winter Storm. The relief force was led by the 6th Panzer Division under General Erhard Raus, along with several other divisions. The main attack would come from Kotelnikovo, about 100 miles southwest of Stalingrad. The offensive began on December 12th. Initially, the attack made good progress. The German panzers broke through the first Soviet defensive lines and advanced quickly. By December 16th, the German relief force was only about 30 miles from the edge of the Stalingrad pocket. Manstein sent messages to Paulus urging him to break out of the pocket and link up with the relief force. If the Sixth Army broke out to the southwest, while the relief force pushed northeast, they could meet in the middle and save the trapped men. But Paulus refused. He cited Hitler's orders to hold Stalingrad and not to abandon the city. He also pointed out that his army was so weak and short of fuel that attempting a breakout might result in the complete destruction of his forces. Then, disaster struck. The Soviets had anticipated the German relief attempt and had positioned strong reserve forces to counter it. On December 19, the Soviet Second Guards Army under General Rodion Malinovsky struck the German relief force with overwhelming power. The Soviet attack stopped the German advance cold. The 6th Panzer Division, which had been the spearhead of the relief attempt, took heavy losses. Additional Soviet attacks threatened to encircle Manstein's relief force as well. Manstein had no choice but to order a retreat. By December 23rd, the relief attempt had failed completely. The Sixth Army's last hope of rescue was gone. The men trapped in Stalingrad now knew they were doomed. To make matters worse, while Manstein was trying to relieve Stalingrad, the Soviets launched another massive offensive, called Operation Little Saturn. This attack targeted the Italian Eighth Army on the Don River and other Axis forces. The Italian forces, like the Romanians before them, quickly collapsed under the Soviet assault. The Soviets advanced rapidly, threatening to encircle not just the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, but also Manstein's Army Group Dawn and other German forces in southern Russia. The Soviet breakthrough forced the Germans to retreat hundreds of kilometers to avoid being encircled themselves. The entire German position in southern Russia was collapsing. To make things even worse, the Soviets captured the airfield at Tatsinskaya on December 24th. This was the main base for the Ju-52 transport planes that were trying to supply the trapped 6th Army. The loss of this airfield made the already difficult airlift almost impossible. German transport planes at Tatsinskaya barely managed to escape before Soviet tanks overran the airfield. Many planes took off while under fire, with some aircraft being destroyed on the runway. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, conditions became increasingly desperate as December turned to January. The trapped soldiers called their prison the Kessel or cauldron, and it was truly a hell on earth. Food rations were cut again and again. By January, soldiers were receiving only a few hundred calories per day, barely enough to keep a person alive at rest, much less for soldiers fighting and enduring extreme cold. Men became walking skeletons. Their uniforms hung off their emaciated frames. They could barely walk, much less fight. Many soldiers were too weak to even carry their weapons. The airfields inside the pocket were under constant Soviet artillery fire. Landing at these airfields became almost suicidal for transport pilots. Many planes were destroyed on the ground, or while trying to land or take off. The main airfield at Potomnik handled most of the airlift traffic. Wounded soldiers desperate to be evacuated would mob any plane that landed. Guards had to force people away at gunpoint just so planes could take off. Some desperate wounded soldiers would try to cling to the wings or landing gear of departing aircraft. None of them survived. They would fall off during takeoff or freeze to death if they somehow managed to hold on. After Potomnik fell to Soviet forces on January 16th, only the improvised airfield at Gumrak remained. It was smaller and in worse condition than Potomnik, but it became the last lifeline to the outside world. But Gumrak also fell to Soviet forces on January 23rd. From that day on, the starving German troops could only receive supplies through crates dropped by parachute from Luftwaffe planes. This method was highly unreliable. Soviet soldiers sometimes captured the supply drops. The crates would fall into the Volga River. Sometimes the German troops were simply too exhausted and starving to search for the supplies among the ruins of the city. In December, the trapped German soldiers had a brief moment of hope. Erich von Manstein was coming to their rescue. But, as we saw, that rescue attempt failed. Manstein had planned Operation Winter Storm, which included two broad operations with different starting points. One would come from Chir and the other from Kotelnikovo, 160 kilometers from Stalingrad. Even for the most skeptical generals of the Nazi regime, the idea that Hitler would abandon the 6th Army was unthinkable, so they held hopes of a possible rescue. In this way, the Wehrmacht was determined to do everything possible to rescue this surrounded army far from Germany. The offensive began on December 12th and reached its closest point on December 16th, but when they were about 50 kilometers away, it was stopped by the 2nd Guards Army, which destroyed the main Nazi attack force, composed of more than 400 tanks. The stop meant that the Soviets counterattacked with everything and forced them to retreat 200 kilometers. The attack, which was carried out by the 6th Panzer Division relentlessly at first, was threatened by another Soviet counterattack in the rear, so it was decided to retreat definitively. To make things worse, the airfield at Tatsinskaya, the main base for the Ju-52 supply planes, fell into Soviet hands. A strict rationing system was imposed to try to survive the winter. Paulus, who was an unconditional admirer of Hitler, realized that for the Führer, the 6th Army, or what remained of it, was little more than a sacrificial piece in the game of war. The lives of the soldiers had no importance to him whatsoever. On December 25th, in the Kessel, 1,180 soldiers died from cold and hunger. For the new year, the Soviets set up a series of kitchens and held parties on the southern shore of the Volga, with the dual purpose of celebrating the year and tormenting the trapped Germans. The Soviets wanted to show the Germans what they were missing and to demoralize them further. On January 8th, the Soviets tightened the perimeter and captured the only airfield that served as a connection with the outside world, Potomnik. The Germans had to rebuild the severely damaged Gumrak airfield, which they themselves had damaged earlier, in order to continue receiving news and minimal supplies. On January 9, 2 Red Army officers appeared at the western line of the German front with an ultimatum from the Stavka for Paulus. The ultimatum offered the Germans honorable surrender terms. The soldiers would be guaranteed their lives, medical treatment for the wounded, and they would be allowed to keep their personal belongings. If this ultimatum was not accepted, the Soviets would launch a final offensive against the Kessel the next day. The ultimatum was rejected. Hitler had forbidden any surrender, and Paulus felt bound by his oath of loyalty to Hitler. The hardships multiplied in the 6th German Army. Epidemics decimated the soldiers. Typhus, dysentery, and other diseases spread unchecked through the crowded, filthy conditions. Discipline no longer existed. The chain of command was breaking down as officers died or became too sick to command. The hunger was so terrible that the Germans sacrificed horses, dogs, and rats to feed themselves. Some soldiers resorted to extreme measures for survival. This was kept secret, and those caught were sometimes executed. But many officers looked the other way because they understood the desperation their men faced. It should be noted that even under these terrible conditions, the resistance of the 6th Army was incredible. The front lines withdrew while fighting and inflicting heavy casualties on the Russians, who were executing the Ring Plan to finish off the Germans. German soldiers, even when starving and freezing, continued to fight with determination that amazed even their enemies. On January 28th, Paulus moved his headquarters to the basements of the Univermag department store. About 3,000 wounded men of various degrees of injury were crammed into these basements, along with men sick with typhus, paratyphoid fever, and dysentery. The conditions were horrific. There was no medicine, no proper sanitation, and barely any food. The stench of infected wounds, disease, and death was overwhelming. Serious cases or those requiring prolonged surgery were simply placed outside in the cold to die, as there was no way to treat them and no point in wasting the meager resources on men who would die anyway. A message arrived on January 30th from Hitler to Paulus. It was not an order to continue fighting or a promise of rescue. Instead, Hitler suggested that Paulus commit suicide. Hitler had just promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German army. Hitler's message pointed out that under his orders, no German field marshal had ever surrendered alive to the enemy. The implication was clear. Paulus should kill himself rather than face the shame of surrender. This was Hitler's way of trying to pressure Paulus into suicide rather than surrender. Hitler knew that if a German field marshal surrendered, it would be a massive propaganda defeat for Nazi Germany. He hoped that Paulus would take the honorable way out and kill himself. On the morning of January 31st, a Russian tank approached Paulus's headquarters at the Univermag. Inside was an interpreter, Major Baer, who had been sent by the Soviets. The interpreter called for Paulus to surrender. Paulus faced an impossible choice. He could obey Hitler's suggestion and kill himself. He could order his men to continue fighting, which would mean their certain death in the next few days. Or he could surrender and save the lives of the men who had survived this far. In the end, Paulus chose to surrender. On the morning of January 31st, 1943, he surrendered with about 90,000 soldiers, the remnants of an army that had once numbered 250,000 men. Only about 5,000 of these survivors would ever return to Germany after the war. Paulus became the first German field marshal to capitulate in German history. By doing so, he disobeyed Hitler and broke the supposed tradition that no German field marshal surrenders. Gripped by Soviet troops, lack of food, and the polar cold of the Russian steppe, for which his troops did not have sufficient equipment, Paulus made an unprecedented gesture in the Wehrmacht. Not all German forces surrendered on January 31st. Some units in the northern pocket of the city continued to fight. On February 2nd, the last group of German soldiers surrendered in the rubble of the Red October tractor factory. This is the date on which the Battle of Stalingrad officially ended. Officially, 91,000 German and Axis soldiers became prisoners from the final battle of the city of Stalingrad. Of these, very few were alive by the beginning of spring. Only about 6,000 Germans survived until the end of the war in 1945. The death rate among the prisoners was appalling. The Soviets were overwhelmed by the number of prisoners and had little food or medicine to give them. Many prisoners were already dying from starvation, disease, and frostbite when they surrendered. Epidemics of dysentery and typhus raged through the prisoner camps. Thousands of men died every day. The Soviets put the prisoners to work, but many were so weak that they collapsed and died while working. The prisoners were marched to camps deep in the Soviet Union. Many died on these death marches, collapsing from exhaustion and cold. The survivors faced years of hard labor in Soviet prison camps, and only a small fraction ever saw Germany again. The consequences of this catastrophe were immense and far-reaching for Nazi Germany and the course of World War II. For the first time since the start of the war, Germany lost the initiative and had to go on the defensive. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The Wehrmacht had suffered a crushing defeat from which it would never fully recover. In fact, the Wehrmacht no longer had the logistical elements necessary to advance further east. The banks of the Volga were precisely the easternmost point reached by German troops in Europe. From this point on, the Germans would be retreating. After this battle, the Soviet Union emerged strengthened and with the initiative of the war that was devastating it in the hands of its leaders. The Red Army had proven that it could not only resist the German military machine, but could defeat it. Furthermore, the commander of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, fell into disgrace with Hitler. He lost credibility among the elite of the Nazi regime, as well as prestige among the military, by failing to fulfill his promise to supply the surrounded German forces by air. Göring had confidently assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could keep the Sixth Army supplied. His failure to do so was obvious to everyone. His reputation never recovered from this disaster. The Third Reich lost the entire Sixth Army and part of the Fourth Panzer Army, and countless material resources that could not be replaced as easily as the USSR could replace its own casualties, even though Soviet casualties were even more terrible than the German ones. In fact, between dead, wounded, and prisoners, the Wehrmacht had lost more than 200,000 combatants, many of them experienced veterans who would be very difficult to replace in a short time. These losses included not just soldiers, but also officers, NCOs, specialists, and experienced leaders who could not be easily replaced. The Germans also lost enormous amounts of equipment, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, aircraft, and vast quantities of weapons and ammunition. This equipment could not be quickly replaced, and its loss weakened German forces across the entire Eastern Front. The Soviets, apart from receiving a practically destroyed city, had suffered 1 million civilian deaths and more than 850,000 military casualties during the battle and the surrounding operations. According to the highest estimate, if all the forces that fought on the Volga are included, 150,000 Axis soldiers died or were wounded, and 1,000 Soviet soldiers died or were wounded. This includes prisoners who died in captivity and wounded who died after being evacuated. Nearly 2,000 civilians met their end, including refugees and people who lived in towns and cities where fighting also took place. The total number of dead was up to 2 million people. These staggering numbers make Stalingrad one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The suffering on both sides was beyond imagination. The triumph of this battle transcended the borders of the Soviet Union and inspired all the Allies, encouraging resistance everywhere. It showed that the seemingly invincible German war machine could be defeated. King George VI of England gave the city a sword specially forged in its honor as a tribute to the courage of Stalingrad's defenders. This sword, known as the Sword of Stalingrad, was presented to Stalin at the Tehran Conference in 1943. Even the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda was moved to write poetry about the battle. He wrote the poem Song of Love to Stalingrad, which he recited for the first time on September 30th, 1942, and the poem New Song of Love to Stalingrad in 1943, celebrating the victory. This transformed this struggle into a symbol and a turning point for the entire war. Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance, courage, and the ultimate triumph of the human spirit over tyranny and aggression. The Battle of Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. After Stalingrad, the German army would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From this point on, the Soviets would push the Germans back, slowly but surely, all the way to Berlin. The battle demonstrated the courage and determination of the Soviet people in defending their homeland. It showed that the German Wehrmacht, which had seemed invincible, could be defeated through determination, sacrifice, and proper military strategy. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became the defining symbol of their war effort. The city was later renamed Volgograd as part of de-Stalinization efforts, but during major commemorations and Victory Day celebrations, it is still referred to as Stalingrad, in honor of those who fought and died there. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the bloodiest battles in human history, and perhaps the most important battle of World War II on the Eastern Front. It was a turning point not just in World War II, but in the history of the 20th century. After Stalingrad, Hitler's dream of conquering the Soviet Union and creating a German empire in the East was over. The Red Army would continue to advance westward, liberating Soviet territory, then pushing into Eastern Europe and finally into Germany itself. The world would never be the same after Stalingrad. This was truly the battle that changed history.